In the sterile, silent world of a billionaire's mansion, where money could buy any treatment, but not a single cure, a father was losing his only child. Alistair Finch, a man who commanded global markets with an iron will, was helpless against the mysterious illness consuming his 7-year-old daughter Lily. He trusted only in science, in data in the tangible world he could control. But one desperate night, he found his newly hired black maid, a woman he barely knew, doing the one thing he despised, praying. What he was about to discover about this quiet woman and the secret hidden within his own home would not only defy all logic, but shatter his entire reality. Stay with us as we unravel the story of how a simple prayer ignited a chain of events that stunned doctors, exposed a dark secret, and redefined the meaning of a miracle. Alistair Finch lived his life by a single unwavering creed: what cannot be measured cannot be managed. His world was one of numbers of algorithms of predictable outcomes calculated to the 9th decimal place. It was this philosophy that had allowed him, a boy from the wrong side of the tracks, to build Finch Global, a technology empire that sprawled across continents. His Manhattan penthouse, a marvel of minimalist glass and steel overlooking Central Park, was less a home and more a testament to this creed, a fortress of sterile, calculated perfection. But for the past 6 months, his fortress had become a prison. A gilded, agonizing cage where the only sounds were the soft beep of medical monitors and the heart-wrenching sound of his daughter's shallow breaths. Lily, his 7-year-old light, was fading. It had started subtly, a persistent lethargy the pediatricians dismissed as a virus. Then came the fevers, erratic and untraceable. Soon her joints ached, her appetite vanished, and her vibrant rosy cheeks became ashen. Alistair had deployed his fortune like an army. He flew in specialists from Johns Hopkins, from the Mayo Clinic, from a cutting-edge research facility in Switzerland. They descended on the penthouse, transforming Lily's bedroom into a state-of-the-art ICU. They gave her condition a name as vague as it was terrifying: a typical pediatric autoimmune syndrome with rapid systemic decline. In layman's terms, her body was attacking itself, and the greatest medical minds on the planet didn't know why. They filled her with steroids, immunoglobulins, and experimental biologics. The charts and readouts they showed Alistair were a storm of incomprehensible data, but the only number that mattered was the one going down: Lily's probability of recovery. His wife Clara had been taken by a swift and brutal cancer 3 years prior. The memory was a raw, open wound. He had thrown money at that too, only to learn that wealth was impotent against cellular betrayal. Now, watching his daughter, the last precious piece of Clara he had left, slip away in the same merciless fashion, Alistair felt the foundations of his world crack. Control was an illusion. The household staff moved with hushed, fearful reverence. They had all been with him for years, except for the new maid. Her name was Serafina Washington. She'd been hired 2 months ago through a high-end agency after the previous maid had quit, unable to bear the oppressive sadness of the home. Serafina was in her late 40s, a woman with a quiet, almost unnerving stillness about her. She was from Jamaica, her accent a soft, melodic hum that was a stark contrast to the sharp, clinical sounds of the machines. Alistair barely noticed her. She was efficient, unobtrusive, a shadow who kept the fortress polished while its king watched his princess wither. He knew nothing of her life, and he didn't care to. She was a function, a cog in the machine of his life, a life that now revolved entirely around the readouts on Lily's monitors. One Tuesday night, the storm inside Lily's body raged into a full-blown hurricane. A cytokine storm, Dr. Aris Thorne, the lead immunologist, had called it. Her fever spiked to 105, her heart rate became erratic, The alarms on her monitors, usually a soft chime, began to shriek with an urgency that clawed at Alistair's soul. Nurses rushed in. Dr. Thorne was on the video monitor from his own home barking orders. "We need to push more Solumedrol. Get her on a cooling blanket now. We're losing her." Alistair stood frozen in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He was a spectator at the demolition of his own life. The man who could move markets with a single phone call could do nothing but watch a number on a screen dictate his daughter's fate. The nurses worked frantically, their faces grim masks of concentration. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, they achieved a fragile stability. The alarms ceased their screaming, settling back into their rhythmic, ominous beeping. The fever had broken, but she was left terrifyingly weak, her small chest barely rising and falling beneath the crisp white sheets. Dr. Thorne advised everyone to get some rest, though he would be monitoring her vitals remotely all night. The nurses retreated to a nearby room for a short break, leaving the door ajar. Alistair remained rooted to the spot. He couldn't leave. He couldn't move. He just stared at his daughter, this tiny, fragile creature, tethered to life by a web of tubes and wires. He felt a familiar cold despair seep into his bones. This was it. The end of the line. Science had failed. His money had failed. He had failed. It was in this moment of utter desolation, around 3 a.m., that he felt a presence behind him. He turned his frayed nerves, expecting a nurse with another grim update. But it was Serafina, the maid. She was holding a dust cloth, as if she had been in the middle of her nightly duties. Their eyes met for a brief second. He saw in hers not pity, but a profound and empathetic sorrow that startled him. He expected her to mutter a clumsy apology and retreat. Instead, she gave a slight, respectful nod and glided past him into the room. Alistair's first instinct was to snap at her. What was she doing? This was a sterile medical area, not a living room to be dusted. But he was too drained to speak. He watched numb as she didn't go for the furniture. She walked slowly, silently to the far side of Lily's bed. She placed her dust cloth on a small side table, and then she did something that made the cold despair in Alistair's chest ignite into white-hot rage. She knelt. She bowed her head, closed her eyes, and clasped her hands together. Her shoulders were straight, her posture one of serene and focused intent. Her lips began to move, but no sound came out. She was praying. Here in this temple of science and medicine, surrounded by millions of dollars of technology, this woman was performing a primitive, superstitious ritual over his dying daughter. It was an insult, an affront to everything he believed in, to every specialist he had hired, to the very memory of his wife, whose death had cemented his atheism. He strode into the room, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet, every muscle in his body coiled with fury. He was about to grab her by the arm, to drag her out of the room and fire her on the spot. He opened his mouth to unleash a torrent of vitriol. But then he heard it. A whisper. Not from Serafina, but from the bed. A single weak, raspy word he hadn't heard in weeks. "Mummy." Alistair froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He looked from the praying maid to his daughter. Lily's eyes, which had been closed and vacant for days, were now cracked open, a sliver of their familiar blue, staring unfocused at the ceiling. She had spoken. And in that moment, the unshakable, data-driven world of Alistair Finch was rocked to its very core. The word hung in the air, fragile yet immense. "Mummy." Lily's eyes fluttered closed again, and her breathing returned to its shallow, monitored rhythm. But it had happened. A moment of lucidity in a sea of unconsciousness. Alistair's rage evaporated, replaced by a bewildering cocktail of shock, hope, and confusion. He looked at Serafina, who was now rising slowly from her knees, her face calm and unreadable. She hadn't seemed to notice Lily's whisper. Her focus had been absolute. "What do you think you're doing?" Alistair's voice was a low growl, but the fire had gone out of it. It was now laced with a tremor he couldn't control. Serafina turned to face him. She didn't flinch or look away. Her gaze was direct, her dark eyes holding a depth that unsettled him. "I was praying for her, sir. For peace. For healing. I don't pay you to pray." He shot back the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "This room is a sterile field. You have no right." "A soul does not need a sterile field, Mr. Finch," she replied, her voice as soft as velvet, but with a spine of steel. "Only a space to be heard. I meant no disrespect to the doctors or their work. I was simply doing what I can do." Before Alistair could formulate a response, one of the private nurses, a woman named Caitlin, bustled back in. "Sir, I heard a sound. Did Lily—" "She spoke." Alistair said the words, feeling foreign. "She said a word." Caitlin rushed to the bedside, checking the monitors. "Vitals are unchanged. Neurological response is still minimal. Are you sure, sir? Sometimes in these states the mind can play tricks." "I'm not delusional." Alistair snapped, his irritation returning. "She said, 'Mommy.'" Caitlin offered a sympathetic but skeptical smile. She glanced at Serafina, a flicker of professional disapproval in her eyes. "The cleaning staff should really be instructed to stay out of the active care zone, sir." Serafina simply picked up her dust cloth, gave a slight nod, and walked out of the room, as silent as she had entered. Alistair was left standing there, his mind a battlefield. Coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. A random firing of synapses in a dying brain. It meant nothing. And yet, it had happened at that exact moment. The next morning brought the formidable presence of Eleanor Vance, his late wife's older sister. Eleanor was a woman carved from ice, all sharp angles and sharper opinions. She saw herself as the guardian of Clara's memory, and by extension, the protector of Lily. She arrived every morning at 10 a.m. sharp, armed with kale smoothies Lily couldn't drink, and a running commentary of everything Alistair was doing wrong. "You look dreadful, Alistair," she said, kissing the air beside his cheek. "Any change?" "She spoke last night," he said, omitting the context. Eleanor's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. "She did. What did she say?" "What did Dr. Thorne say?" "Is this the breakthrough?" "It was one word. Thorne says it's likely an anomaly. Nothing on the EEG has changed." Eleanor's brief flicker of hope died, replaced by her usual critical demeanor. She surveyed the room, her gaze missing nothing. "It's also clinical. Clara would have wanted Flower's soft music, not all this beeping." As she spoke, her eyes landed on Serafina, who was quietly emptying a small waste bin in the corner. "Who is that?" Eleanor's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "The new maid, Serafina." "I don't like her," Eleanor declared instantly. "There's a strangeness about her, the way she just floats around. The last one at least had the decency to look miserable. This one looks serene. It's unnatural." Alistair didn't have the energy to defend a woman he barely knew against his sister-in-law's baseless prejudice. He just grunted a non-committal response and turned his attention back to Lily. But Eleanor wasn't done. Later that afternoon, as Alistair was on a conference call in his study, she sought him out, her face a mask of indignation. "Alistair, we need to talk. I just had a word with Nurse Caitlin." She began, closing the door behind her. "She told me the most appalling thing. She said you found that maid, that Serafina, in Lily's room last night, performing some sort of voodoo ritual over her. She was praying Eleanor. And it wasn't a ritual, Alistair said, wearily pinching the bridge of his nose. Praying, kneeling at her bedside. In this house, Alistair, have you lost your mind? We are people of science, of reason. Clara would be horrified. This is a highly vulnerable child. That woman is uneducated. She's probably covered in germs, bringing her superstitious nonsense into a medically sterile environment. You must fire her immediately. She's a liability. She was there when Lily spoke, Alistair heard himself say, and he wasn't sure why he was defending her. Oh, for heaven's sake, don't be ridiculous. It was a coincidence. A tragic, meaningless coincidence. You're exhausted and grasping at straws. Get rid of her, Alistair, for Lily's sake, for Clara's memory. She is a contamination. The word contamination struck a nerve. It was what the doctors had said was happening inside Lily's blood. Eleanor's argument, though draped in prejudice, was rooted in the same logic Alistair himself had always lived by. Letting Seraphina stay was irrational. It was a deviation from the plan. It was acknowledging a variable he couldn't measure. He agreed to think about it. But for the rest of the day, a single seed of doubt had been planted in the barren soil of his certainty. He watched Seraphina on the security monitors. She went about her work with a quiet dignity. There was nothing strange or sinister about her. She polished silver. She straightened paintings. She scrubbed floors. Yet there was an aura of profound calm about her, an inner peace that seemed almost defiant in a house so saturated with grief. That evening, Dr. Thorne called with the latest lab results. They were not good. Her inflammatory markers are through the roof, Alistair. Thorne said, his voice grim. The solumedrol isn't touching the inflammation. If we can't get this under control in the next 48 hours, we may need to discuss palliative care options. The words hit Alistair like a physical blow. Palliative care. The end. They were giving up. After the call, he walked back to Lily's room in a daze. The world was tilting on its axis. Science had reached its limit. His army of specialists was retreating. He was alone on a cliff edge with his daughter in his arms. He sat by her bed, took her small, limp hand in his, and did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He looked up at the ceiling at the cold, empty space above him, and felt a desperate, unfamiliar plea forming in his mind. Help her. Please. Anyone. Anything. A few hours later, past midnight, he heard a soft footstep. It was Seraphina on her nightly cleaning round. She paused at the doorway, her eyes falling on Alistair holding Lily's hand. He expected her to leave. Instead, she entered, holding a small glass of water. "You should drink something, Mr. Finch," she said softly, placing it on the table beside him. "You cannot pour from an empty cup." He looked up at her, his face a ruin of despair. "They're giving up on her." Seraphina looked at Lily, her expression full of a deep, abiding compassion. "The doctors maybe. But God has not." "There is no God," Alistair whispered, the old, bitter conviction, a reflex. Seraphina didn't argue. She simply said, "May I sit for a moment, not to pray, just to be with her?" He didn't have the strength to say no, so he just nodded. She pulled up a small chair on the other side of the bed. They sat in silence for a long time, two strangers from different worlds, united by the small, sleeping child between them. The only sound was the rhythmic hum and beep of the machines, a soundtrack to their shared vigil. And in that shared silence, Alistair felt the first crack in his fortress of reason. He was at the end of what was measurable, and for the first time in his life, he was terrified of what lay beyond. The next 36 hours were a slow, agonizing descent. Lily's condition deteriorated exactly as Dr. Thorne had predicted. Her blood pressure became unstable, and a faint, mottled rash began to creep up her tiny limbs, a sign of systemic vascular collapse. The team of nurses now working around the clock spoke in clipped, hushed tones, their movements efficient, but lacking the hopeful energy of the previous weeks. They were managing a decline, not fighting for a recovery. Eleanor was a constant nerve-jangling presence. She had taken it upon herself to supervise the staff, her sharp eyes following Serafina's every move. She had forbidden Serafina from entering Lily's wing of the penthouse, stationing herself like a sentinel in the hallway. "We can't have any more of your superstitious theatrics," she had hissed at the maid, loud enough for Alistair to hear. Serafina had simply bowed her head and retreated to clean the other side of the vast apartment. Alistair was living on black coffee and raw fear. He hadn't slept in 2 days. He sat by Lily's bed watching the numbers on the screen, his entire world compressed into those glowing green digits. He felt like a man on a sinking ship, watching the water rise inch by inch, knowing the inevitable was coming. The crisis came just before dawn on the second day. A long, piercing alarm cut through the quiet hum of the room. Lily's oxygen saturation was plummeting. The nurse, Caitlin, yelled for her colleague and started manual resuscitation with an ambu bag. Alistair was shoved aside as they worked. "Her airway is constricting, Page Dr. Thorne now. Tell him it's a code blue." The room became a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Dr. Thorne's face appeared on the large monitor, his expression stark. He was directing the nurses, calling out drug dosages and ventilator settings. It's a full-blown anaphylactoid reaction. But to what nothing has changed. Alistair stood pressed against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs, so hard he thought they might break. He could hear his own ragged breathing, a counter-rhythm to the frantic beeps of the failing monitors. This was it. The moment he had dreaded, the moment his nightmares were made of. He was watching his daughter die. Eleanor rushed in her silk robe, flying behind her. "What is happening? My God, what's that noise?" Her eyes widened in terror at the scene. She saw the nurses fighting to get a new line, and saw the plunging numbers, and her composure finally shattered. Her eyes darted around the room and landed on a figure standing quietly in the doorway. It was Serafina. She must have heard the commotion. She was standing just outside the room, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a mask of intense, prayerful concentration. She wasn't intruding, merely bearing witness from the threshold. For Eleanor, in her grief and terror, this was the final provocation. Serafina became the focal point for all her fear and rage. "You," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "Get out, get away from her. This is your fault. You and your bad juju, your dark energy. Get her out of here, Alistair." Eleanor moved to physically push Serafina away from the door, but the maid stood her ground, her eyes never leaving Lily. "Mum, please," Serafina said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "This is not the time. Don't you speak to me." Eleanor sobbed, her voice cracking. "You are a curse on this house." Inside the room, Dr. Thorne's voice was getting graver. "Her pressure is bottoming out. We're losing her pulse. Caitlin, start chest compressions." The sound of the nurse beginning the rhythmic press on Lily's tiny chest was the sound that broke Alistair Finch. A dry, ragged sob tore from his throat. Everything had failed. The science, the money, the logic. It was all useless dust. He looked at the frantic scene, at his hysterical sister-in-law, and at the quiet, unmovable maid in the doorway. In that moment of absolute, soul-crushing despair, something inside him snapped. His entire life had been a monument to control, to the rejection of the unseeable, the unprovable. But his control was a lie. His proof was dying in front of him. What was there left to lose? He heard a voice, and it took him a second to realize it was his own. It was loud, raw, and full of a terrifying authority that cut through Eleanor's hysterics and the medical panic. Enough. The room fell silent, save for the blare of the alarms. Every eye turned to him. Eleanor stared, her mouth agape. The nurses paused. Alistair looked past them all, his gaze locking with Seraphina's. He saw no triumph in her eyes, no, "I told you so." He saw only a deep, shared well of sorrow and a flicker of unwavering faith. His next words were quiet, but they resonated like a thunderclap in the silent room. "Let her in." "Alistair, are you insane?" Eleanor gasped. "I said let her in." He repeated his voice, dropping to a deadly calm. He pointed at Seraphina. "Let her pray." It was a complete abdication of everything he was. A surrender, a desperate last-ditch Hail Mary from a lifelong atheist. The nurses looked at each other confused. Dr. Thorne on the screen was speechless. "Sir, that is highly unorthodox," Nurse Caitlin began. "Do it!" Alistair commanded, his eyes blazing with the fire of a man with nothing left to lose. Hesitantly, Eleanor stepped aside. Seraphina walked into the room. She didn't perform any grand theatrics. She didn't chant or wail. She walked calmly to Lily's bedside opposite the nurses and gently placed her hand on Lily's small, still foot. She bowed her head. The nurses, taking it as their cue, were about to resume compressions. "Wait," Seraphina said, her voice soft but clear. "Just a moment. Please." Alistair nodded at the nurses. "Wait." Seraphina closed her eyes. Her lips moved silently. The entire room, the billionaire, the socialite, the trained nurses, the world-renowned doctor on the screen, was held captive by the silent prayer of a Jamaican maid. The only sound was the flatlined tone of the heart monitor. It was an eternity compressed into seconds, and then a beep, faint, weak. But there, another beep, stronger this time. Everyone stared at the monitor. A jagged green line, a perfect sinus rhythm had appeared on the screen. Lily's oxygen saturation, which had been in the 60s, jumped to 75. Then 80. Then 92. Dr. Thorne's voice, now a stunned whisper, came from the monitor. What in God's name is happening? Her pressure is stabilizing. The arrhythmia is gone." Lily took a breath. A deep, shuddering gasp all on her own. It was the most beautiful sound Alistair had ever heard. The crisis had passed. As suddenly and inexplicably as it had begun, it was over. Lily was not healed, not by a long shot. She was still critically ill, still unconscious, but she was alive. She had been on the very brink of death, and she had stepped back. Seraphina opened her eyes, squeezed Lily's foot gently, and then stepped back, her work done. She looked at Alistair, her expression not one of victory, but of quiet, humble gratitude. Alistair stared at her, then at his daughter's stable vital signs on the monitor, then back at Seraphina. The logical, ordered universe he had constructed for himself had not just been cracked. It had been atomized, and in its place was a question terrifying and wondrous all at once. What had just happened here? Eleanor stared at Seraphina, her face pale with a mixture of shock and a dawning, horrified awe. The nurses busied themselves, rechecking lines and making notes, their professional masks hiding their utter bewilderment. In the aftermath of the storm, a new and profound silence settled over the room, the silence of impossibility made real. The event in Lily's room, what the staff had begun to whisper about as the moment, changed the atmosphere in the penthouse. The oppressive despair was replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of wonder. Dr. Thorne, a man of empirical evidence and peer-reviewed studies, was at a complete loss. He flew back to New York the next day, personally running a battery of new tests. He spoke in clipped professional terms, but Alistair could see the deep-seated confusion in his eyes. "I can't explain it, Alistair," Thorne admitted, standing in the penthouse study. "Her inflammatory cascade just stopped. It's as if a switch was flipped. We have no medical precedent for a spontaneous reversal of this magnitude. It's anomalous." Eleanor, for her part, was uncharacteristically quiet. The raw terror of that night, followed by the inexplicable recovery, had stripped her of her acidic certainty. She looked at Serafina, now not with contempt, but with a wary, fearful respect, as if she were an unpredictable force of nature. Alistair, however, could not function on a diet of wonder and anomaly. His mind, trained to deconstruct, analyze, and understand, churned relentlessly. He needed an explanation. Coincidence was no longer a sufficient answer. A miracle was not a variable he could accept. Therefore, there had to be something about Serafina Washington herself that he was missing. He did what he always did. When faced with an unknown quantity, he gathered data. He called his head of security, a formidable ex-Mossad agent named Marcus Thorne. "I want to know everything about her," Alistair ordered, his voice low. "Serafina Washington. I want to know where she was born, where she went to school, who her parents were, what she ate for breakfast, every job she's ever had, every dollar she's ever earned. I want a background check so deep you can tell me the name of her first pet. And Marcus, be discreet. No one, especially not her, can know you're looking. Consider it done, Mr. Finch." Marcus replied, his tone suggesting this was no different than investigating a rival corporation. For the next 3 days, while Lily remained stable, a state that was in itself a miracle, Alistair waited. He treated Serafina with a new cautious courtesy. He watched her constantly. She seemed utterly unaware of the seismic shift she had caused, or of the intense scrutiny she was under. She went about her duties with the same quiet grace. She polished the marble floors, arranged flowers, and when permitted, would sit by Lily's bed, sometimes reading passages from a small worn Bible in a soft, melodic whisper. Alistair found himself listening. He had always considered religious texts to be collections of primitive myths. But hearing the words from the Book of Psalms or the Gospel of John read in Serafina's calm, resonant voice, he felt not their dogma, but their poetry, their ancient, desperate plea for hope in a broken world. It was unsettling. On the 4th day, Marcus called. "I have the file, sir. I think you should see this in person." An hour later, Marcus was in Alistair's study, laying a thick file on the polished mahogany desk. "Serafina Washington is not who you think she is, sir," Marcus began. "Or rather, she is much more than you think." Alistair opened the file. The first page was a standard summary. Born in St. Anne Parish, Jamaica. Age 48. No criminal record. Excellent references from previous domestic positions in New York. The next page was a copy of her passport, and then Alistair turned the page and his breath caught in his throat. Staring back at him was a professional ID card. It showed a younger Serafina, smiling, wearing a crisp nurse's uniform. The ID was from the University Hospital of the West Indies in Kingston. The title under her name read, Serafina Washington, RN, BSN, Head Nurse Pediatric Oncology and Intensive Care Unit. Alistair stared at the photo, his mind struggling to connect the image of this confident medical professional with the quiet woman who cleaned his floors. He flipped through the next pages. There were commendations awards for exemplary patient care, a letter of recommendation from the hospital's chief of medicine praising her unparalleled diagnostic intuition, and profound gift for calming the most frightened children and their families. She had been a nurse for over 20 years. Not just any nurse, but a highly decorated senior pediatric ICU nurse, specializing in the most critical cases. "What happened?" Alistair asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why is she working as a maid?" Marcus pointed to the next section of the report. It was a collection of Jamaican news articles from 5 years ago. The headlines told a brutal story. Hurricane Gilbert II devastates rural parishes. Local clinic, sole source of care for hundreds destroyed. Community mourns hero nurse's family. The story pieced itself together. Serafina had not only worked at the main hospital, but had also used her own savings to found and run a small free clinic in her rural hometown. The hurricane had destroyed it. Worse, it had taken her home, and in a tragic mudslide, her husband and her teenage son. She had lost everything. The report showed that she had spent a year trying to rebuild, but without funds or government support, it was impossible. Emotionally and financially shattered with no family left, she had used a distant cousin's sponsorship to emigrate to the United States, hoping for a new start. But her Jamaican nursing credentials were not easily transferable. The process was long, expensive, and required years of retraining and exams. Needing to make a living immediately, she had turned to the one thing that was always in demand: domestic work. Alistair leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He felt a profound sense of shame. He had looked at Serafina and seen a simple, uneducated maid. He had judged her, dismissed her, sneered at her superstitious rituals. But he had been the ignorant one. Her quiet confidence was not the placidity of a simple mind. It was the earned calm of a woman who had faced death and tragedy head-on for decades. Her stillness was not emptiness. It was a reservoir of strength. The hand she had placed on Lily's foot was not just the hand of a prayerful woman. It was the hand of a highly trained medical professional, a hand that had likely saved hundreds of children's lives. Her prayer was not an act of blind faith. It was an appeal to a higher power from someone who intimately understood the limits of medicine. He thought back to every interaction, the way she moved around the medical equipment with an easy familiarity, the way her eyes would scan the monitors not with idle curiosity, but with a quick, appraising glance. The comment she'd made to him, "You cannot pour from an empty cup," was not just a platitude. It was the kind of advice a seasoned caregiver gives a panicked parent. He had hired a maid, but he had been given a guardian angel in disguise, a woman with a skill set perfectly, almost impossibly matched to his daughter's crisis. Picking up the phone, he buzzed his head of staff. "Find Serafina Washington. Ask her to come to my study. And tell her it is not to clean." Serafina entered the study with the same quiet composure she carried everywhere. She held no cleaning supplies. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her. She stood before his desk, waiting. Alistair gestured to one of the plush leather armchairs. "Please, Serafina, sit." She looked at the chair, then at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, before she sat her back perfectly straight. He slid the file across the desk, turning it to face her. It was open to the page with her nursing ID. 20 years in pediatric intensive care. Alistair said, his voice heavy with a respect that was entirely new. "Head nurse of oncology. Why didn't you tell me?" Serafina looked at the photo of her younger self. A ghost of a sad smile touched her lips. "You hired a maid, Mr. Finch. Not a nurse. My past is my own. I did not think it was relevant to my duties." "Not relevant." Alistair leaned forward, his voice cracking with emotion. "My daughter is dying of a mysterious illness, and one of the most experienced pediatric nurses in the Western Hemisphere is polishing my silverware. I think it's damn relevant. That part of my life is over, she said softly, a profound weariness in her tone. I lost my clinic, my family. I lost the heart for it. Coming here just being a quiet presence in the background, it was all I had left in me. But you watched her, Alistair insisted. You didn't just clean around the equipment. I saw you on the cameras. You watched everything. Serafina finally met his gaze. Of course I watched. She is a sick child. It is in my blood to observe. It is not something I can turn off. This was the opening Alistair needed. He stood up and began to pace the energy in the room, shifting from confession to consultation. Then tell me. Tell me what you've seen. Not as a maid, not as a woman of faith. Tell me what you've seen as a nurse. Something the others have missed. Because they are missing something, aren't they? Serafina was silent for a long moment, as if debating whether to cross a threshold she had long ago closed behind her. Finally she spoke. They are brilliant doctors, Mr. Finch. Their tests are the best in the world. They are looking for a disease. They see the data, the inflammation, the systemic response. But I have not been looking at the data. I have been looking at the child. She paused, gathering her thoughts. There is something small. I have noticed it a few times, but it comes and goes so quickly. It would never show up on a timed observation. A discoloration under her fingernails. Alistair stopped pacing. What are nail beds? They check her capillary refill constantly. No, not the color of the bed itself, Serafina corrected him gently. A faint bluish-grey line, almost a shadow deep under the nail near the cuticle. And a rash. It is not the mottled rash from her poor circulation. This one is different. It's very faint, almost like a lace pattern on her skin. I have seen it twice on her torso when the nurses changed her gown. It fades within minutes. They are so focused on their tasks, they might not see it. Alistair stared at her. Why in God's name wouldn't you say anything? To whom? She replied the question devoid of accusation. To the world-famous immunologist who sees me as the help. To the nurse who believes I am a contamination risk. To the grieving father who thought I was performing voodoo. You did not trust me, Mr. Finch. And a voice without trust is just noise. Her words were a physical blow. She was right. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance and prejudice that he had created an environment where the one person who might hold a key piece of the puzzle was silenced. I trust you now, Serafina, he said, his voice thick with remorse. What do you think it is? I do not know, she admitted. But in my experience, strange rashes and nail discolorations, things that come and go, often point to something environmental. A toxin, an exposure. The body is reacting to an enemy it cannot name, and it is sending out strange signals. The doctors are fighting the reaction. But they haven't found the cause. Environmental. The word electrified the air. They had tested Lily for everything: genetic markers, latent viruses, bacterial infections. But they had assumed the environment, her hermetically sealed, air-purified penthouse room, was the safest place on Earth. Alistair's mind, now fired with a new and urgent purpose, began to race. The renovation, he said, thinking aloud. We renovated this entire wing 8 months ago, just before she got sick. Top of the line everything. A new HVAC system, new insulation soundproofing. Suddenly, a connection sparked a dark and terrible thought. The contractor, he said slowly, a cold dread creeping up his spine. The general contractor for the renovation was Vance Construction. Eleanor's husband. He looked at Serafina, whose face remained calm, but whose eyes showed she understood the grave implication. "Marcus," Alistair barked into his intercom, "get in here, now, and get me the chief engineer from the CDC's Environmental Health Division on the phone. Tell him it's a matter of national security. I don't care what time it is." A new war had just been declared, but this time it wasn't against a mysterious disease. It was a hunt for a poison, and it was starting in the very heart of his own home. He and Serafina, the billionaire, and the maid-turned-nurse were now an unlikely team. She had provided the observation. He would provide the firepower to uncover the truth. The stunning revelation was not just that a prayer had seemingly worked, but that the woman who offered it held the scientific key that could unlock the entire mystery. The real twist was just beginning to unfold. Within hours, the Finch penthouse was transformed from a sterile ICIO into a forensic investigation zone. A team of 4 environmental health specialists, flown in on Alistair's private jet from the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, swarmed Lily's wing. They arrived in hazmat suits, carrying silver briefcases filled with air samplers, particulate counters and surface swabs. They looked like astronauts exploring a hostile new world. Lily was moved to a different, secure room on the other side of the penthouse, under Serafina's watchful eye. For the first time, Alistair had overruled Dr. Thorne, insisting that Serafina be present as a consultant. To his surprise, Thorne, humbled by the events of the past week, had readily agreed. "At this point, Mr. Finch," he had said over the phone, "I'll take insight from anywhere I can get it." Eleanor was in a state of near collapse. When Alistair told her he was investigating the renovation, she had turned pale. "That's absurd. My husband Robert is meticulous. He used the best materials, the best crews. This is a witch hunt." "I hope you're right, Eleanor," Alistair had replied, his voice cold. "But I'm tearing this room apart down to the studs if I have to." The team worked for hours. They took samples from the ventilation ducts, the drywall, the insulation, the subflooring. They ran spectrometry tests on the paint and the varnish on the custom-built furniture. At first, nothing. The air quality was pristine, the materials all top grade, just as the invoices from Vance Construction had stated. Alistair felt a knot of frustration tightening in his gut. Was Serafina wrong? Was this another dead end? Then one of the engineers, a man named Dr. Ben Carter, called Alistair over to the main air return vent, hidden behind a large impressionist painting. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice muffled by his respirator, "I think we've found something." He pointed his flashlight deep into the ductwork. Inside, behind the main filter, was a secondary acoustic dampener, a thick, foam-like material designed to make the HVAC system whisper quiet. It was not on the original blueprints. "That's an aftermarket addition," Carter said. "Standard material is a non-porous polymer foam. This looks like a recycled composite. Cheaper. And it's wet." A slow, persistent leak from a condensation line had caused the foam to become saturated with moisture. In the dark, warm space of the ductwork, it had become the perfect breeding ground for a biological nightmare. Carter's team took a core sample. They placed it under a portable digital microscope connected to a laptop. On the screen, a horrifying image appeared, a dense, tangled colony of blackish-green filaments. "Stachybotrys cartarum," Carter breathed, his voice grim. "Black mold, but this strain, my God, the mycotoxin profile on the initial readout is off the charts. It's incredibly virulent." The puzzle pieces slammed into place with dizzying, sickening speed. The high-powered HVAC system, designed to create a clean environment, was instead pumping a constant invisible stream of potent neurotoxic mold spores directly into Lily's room. Every breath she took was poison. Her body, in its attempt to fight the foreign invader, had launched a massive systemic autoimmune response. The cytokine storms, the inflammation, the vascular collapse, it was all her immune system going haywire, trying to combat an enemy it couldn't see. Serafina's observations were the key. The fleeting rash and nail discoloration were classic, though rare, dermatological signs of severe mycotoxin exposure. The doctors looking for a disease inside her had never thought to look for a poison outside her. The most damning part came an hour later. Carter ran the material specs on the foam. It was a cheap, substandard composite, manufactured in China, banned in several countries for its tendency to harbor toxic mold. It was a fraction of the cost of the polymer foam specified in the contract. Vance Construction had cut a corner, a big one. To save maybe $50,000 on a multi-million-dollar project, they had poisoned his child. Alistair felt a cold, murderous rage wash over him, so intense it made him dizzy. He walked out of the room, stripping off the protective gear he'd been wearing, and strode to the living area where Eleanor was waiting, wringing her hands. "Robert," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get him on the phone, now." Eleanor fumbled for her phone. A few moments later, Robert Vance's cheerful, booming voice was on speakerphone. "Alistair, heard you had the spooks crawling all over the place. Find anything?" Alistair picked up the phone. "I found a non-spec band acoustic dampener in Lily's HVAC system. Robert, it's full of stashy batteries. You have 60 seconds to explain to me why you installed it before I call the district attorney and have you arrested for attempted murder." The line went dead silent. The only sound was Eleanor's sharp, terrified gasp. "Alistair, I can explain." Robert stammered, his jovial mask gone. It was a supply chain issue. The specified material was back-ordered. We had to keep the project on schedule. My foreman made a substitution. He assured me it was comparable. Comparable. Alistair's voice was a low snarl. "It's a toxic sponge, Robert. It has been slowly killing my daughter for 6 months. Did you know you were using substandard materials?" The silence stretched on. Then a broken sob from Eleanor. "He did," she whispered, looking at Alistair, her face ashen with guilt. "The company, it was in trouble. We were in debt. Robert has been cutting corners for the last year just to stay afloat. He told me no one would ever know." The confession hung in the air, ugly and devastating. It wasn't malice. It was greed. Apathetic criminal negligence driven by financial desperation. They had gambled with his daughter's life to save their failing company. Alistair looked at the woman who had been his sister-in-law, the woman who had sanctimoniously guarded his wife's memory, while her own husband was the source of the poison. He felt nothing but a vast, empty coldness. The confrontation was over. The enemy was no longer a mystery. It was family. He turned without another word and walked back toward the room where Lily was. Dr. Thorne was already on the line with the CDC team, frantically devising a new treatment protocol, not immunosuppressants, but chelation therapy and antifungal agents, to cleanse her body of the toxins. Alistair stopped at the doorway. Serafina was sitting by Lily's bed, holding her hand. She looked up and saw the look on his face. She didn't need to ask. She knew he had found the source. He walked over and stood on the other side of the bed. "They are moving her to a sterile unit at Mount Sinai immediately," he said. "The new treatment begins tonight." Serafina nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She will be well now, Mr. Finch. The Lord has cleared the path." Alistair looked down at his daughter, then at the woman who had saved her. Faith had opened the door, and science was about to walk through it. He had needed both. And in his arrogance, he had almost rejected the one that mattered most. "Serafina," he said, his voice raw, "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank God," she replied softly. I was just the vessel he chose to speak through. As the paramedics arrived to transport Lily, Alistair knew this was not just the end of a nightmare. It was the beginning of a profound and life-altering reckoning. His fortress had been breached, his creed shattered, and his family torn apart by a terrible secret. And the person who had led him through the wreckage was the last person on Earth he ever would have expected. The change in Lily was astonishingly rapid. Once removed from the toxic environment and placed on a targeted chelation and antifungal therapy, her body responded almost immediately. Within 48 hours, her inflammatory markers plummeted to near normal levels. Within a week, she was awake and lucid. The moment Alistair walked into her hospital room and she smiled, saying, "Hi, Daddy," was the moment his world was reborn. Serafina was a constant vital presence throughout the recovery. She consulted with the doctors, explained the complex treatments to Alistair, and most importantly, she was there for Lily, soothing her with soft Jamaican lullabies. Her role had seamlessly transitioned from maid to an indispensable caregiver and family advocate. The legal and familial fallout was brutal. Alistair did not press criminal charges against Robert and Eleanor Vance, choosing instead to dismantle their lives with surgical precision. Through a swift and merciless legal process, he forced them to liquidate their company to pay for all of Lily's medical care, and then cut them out of his life completely. Their punishment was not prison, but shame and ruin. They never returned to the penthouse. Alistair sold the apartment and bought a sprawling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a place with vast green lawns and clean air where Lily could heal. One sunny afternoon, as Lily chased butterflies on the lawn, Alistair sat with Serafina on the porch. The dynamic between them had settled into a comfortable, respectful partnership. "I've been thinking," Alistair began, his eyes fixed on his vibrant, laughing daughter. "What happened to Lily? It can't have been for nothing. There have to be other children suffering from mystery illnesses because no one is looking in the right place." He turned to Serafina, his expression filled with a new purpose. "I'm starting a foundation. It will be dedicated to funding research into pediatric environmental health investigating cases like Lily's. I want to call it the Washington Finch Foundation. And I want you to run it." Serafina stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Alistair, I am a nurse. I don't know how to run a foundation." "You are more than a nurse," he said firmly. "You are a leader with an integrity and intuition that I've never seen. You saw what an army of specialists missed. You'll have every resource a blank check to build it from the ground up. This is your calling, Serafina. You lost your clinic once. I'm giving you a chance to build a global one." Tears the first Alistair had ever seen her shed streamed down her face. They were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming redemption. The life she thought she had lost forever was being offered back to her, grander than she could have ever imagined. She looked at Lily, then back at the man whose heart had been broken open, and a radiant smile broke through her tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Theirs was not a story of a single instantaneous miracle, but of something more profound, a miracle of observation, of humility, and of faith, creating a path for science to find the truth. Alistair, Lily, and Serafina, the billionaire, the child, and the caregiver, had become an unconventional family, forged in crisis, and dedicated to building a new foundation of hope for children everywhere. The story of Alistair, Lily, and Serafina is a powerful reminder that heroes and answers can be found in the most unexpected places. It shows us that true strength isn't about control, but about the humility to accept what we don't know. It's about looking past labels like billionaire and maid to see the human being underneath. Their journey from a sterile sick room to the dawn of a new foundation wasn't just about finding a cure. It was about discovering a deeper truth that faith and science are not enemies, but partners in the quest for healing. What do you think about Alistair's transformation? Have you ever witnessed an act of faith or intuition that defied a logical explanation? We would love to hear your stories and thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs a story of hope, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire and amaze. Thank you for watching.